on Japan be seen? Above all, could a Stalinist regime accuse another of crimes against humanity? The intuitive truth remains that the Nuremberg defendants were able to defend themselves and were given a fairer trial than any Nazi court would give. The defenses that were offered included military and bureaucratic claims to be solely obeying orders, nimble-minded legal defense, fanatical defiance, and claims of insanity, of actions perpetrated under a mesmeric trance in the spell of Hitler. The Nuremberg trials acquitted some defendants. Some were imprisoned. Many were executed. Some died shouting Heil Hitler. Goering escaped execution by suicide. Horrors that rank alongside the final solution emerged in Asia. Japan's war criminals stood trial for crimes that included massacres of both civilians and prisoners of war, and even mass human vivisection. Again, many of these war criminals paid for their crimes with their own lives. Most prominent among the executed was ex-Prime Minister Aidekai Tojo. The Cold War in Europe started where World War II ended, in Berlin. In April 1948, the Soviet forces in the Russian zone of Germany blockaded the city. They refused to allow road or rail supplies to the western areas of the occupied German capital. The communists did not use military action, afraid of risking war with America. Their intention was to starve the Western Allies out, seeing their influence and martial aid as undermining the Soviet position in eastern Germany. The Western nations, though, refused to back down and mounted the famous Berlin airlift to supply the beleaguered people of Berlin. Aircraft flew day and night, carrying supplies of all kinds, even coal. It was not until a year's siege that the Soviets relented. The tense standoff between the two eventually nuclear-armed factions was to dominate nearly 50 years of world history. It was a war of confrontation, intimidation, and bluff. Actual fighting was by proxy in remote parts of the world. That the world of 1945 learned a lesson from the history of 1918 is shown by the treatment of the vanquished powers. The planes flew supplies to save the citizens of Berlin as much as to supply the Western troops. It would have been easy to abandon Berlin and its people to communist domination as not of strategic value. Long before a later US president was to describe himself as a Berliner, those words were put into practice. Germany was not punished with the crippling reparations that had provided Hitler with such ammunition in the interwar years. The western sectors of Germany were rebuilt, given secure democratic structures, and eventually became a full member of the Western Alliance. Eastern Germany was eventually given a communist government, and within the Soviet satellites, East Germany became a fanatical hardline police state that entrapped its citizens behind a wall of concrete and steel. As a US general was instrumental in the recovery of Europe, so it was with Japan. Douglas MacArthur, having received the surrender of the Japanese, became the governor of Japan and framed a new society. A democratic state that constitutionally rejected militarism and aggression. Through industry and hard work, the Japanese came to achieve the economic wealth and status in the world that they had sought through military aggression. Winston Churchill said that it was the World War II of numbers, of statistics, that terrified him the most. The war, when expressed in numbers, reveals a tremendous cost in human life and suffering, in numbers that lie beyond the ordinary imagination. The greatest numbers of lives lost were suffered by the Soviet Union and by China. The USSR lost 13.5 million soldiers and 8 million civilians. In the post-war Soviet Union, women were to outnumber men by a third. Such were the wartime losses. In China, perhaps 1.5 million troops were to die, but the total of civilian dead was over 20 million. Japan's ruthless ideology of racial superiority had seen a deliberate famine sweep through China as the imperial army appropriated entire crops. The defeated nations reaped the rewards of aggression. German armed forces had reached a peak number of over 10 million men in uniform. 3.5 million of those were never to return to their homes. 2 million German civilians were to die under the weight of Allied bombing and in the dreadful last days of the war in the East. Japan's armed forces were to total nearly 6 million. Nearly half of that number, more than 2.75 million, died, as did 1 million Japanese civilians. In the occupied countries, the experience of the war would be determined by race and political ideology. Occupied France lost less than 250,000 soldiers and 173,000 civilians, many to Allied air raids. However, in occupied Poland, Nazi racist ideology, a belief system that saw Slavic peoples as subhuman and Jews as the origin of all evil, worked to its logical conclusion. 6 million Polish civilians died, 3 million of those Polish Jews, one part of the final solution. Every occupied country in Europe shares in the final solution. It is, to some states' shame, that the non-Jewish population gladly collaborated with deportations to the death camps. Equally, some nations can be proud that whatever other collaboration was made with Nazism, no part was taken in the Holocaust. Denmark transported all its 5,500 Jews to neutral Sweden. Only 77 Danish Jews were to die. All Bulgarian Jews escaped due to the refusal of the Bulgarian king to allow deportation. Even fascist Italy refused to take part in deportations. It was not until the fall of Mussolini that Jewish Italians fell victim to Nazism. Poland was squeezed on two sides with attacks by an equally ruthless and sadistic Soviet Union. Of 1 million Polish servicemen, 600,000 did not live to see the peace. The discovery by the Germans in 1944 of the bodies of many thousands of Polish officers killed by the Red Army was one of the first indications that the Soviet Union was not